My name is Guy Michael Alder. I was born May 7th, 1943 in Denver, Colorado. I just turned 81 years old and I'm getting younger.
My name is Marian Farnsworth Alder. I was born in Utah, raised in several states. I am 76 years old.
Today's date is October 16th, 2024, and we are going to do a life legacy film. We think it's important to have a life history of some sort, and this one I think will be more memorable because our children, grandchildren, and others will be able to hear us and see us and kind of have a memory.
And I wish I had something like this because I miss hearing my grandparents' voices.
Okay, my parents were exceptional to me. My mom's name was Afton Lenora Worthen Alder. She came from a home where her parents were not active in the church. My grandpa evidently had been baptized a member when he was little, but my grandma didn't learn until after his death. And my mom was a very beautiful lady.
Our first date, for whatever reason, he was off working, and it was a double date. So I was in the car with my friend and her date, and we drove up to Mike's house, and they knocked on the door, and this gorgeous person comes out. Now I'm looking at her in semi-dark, and I thought, he's already got a date. And I was really uncomfortable. I didn't know what I was going to do because I wasn't going to go with another girl. And it was his mom, and she was always dressed. It didn't matter whether she was in her Levi's or whatever. She was always dressed beautifully.
My dad, Guy Davis Alder, came from a home of 10 children. His mom divorced his dad at an early age. He was a polygamist, and she said that she didn't want to have anything to do with that. He was raised in a home where they didn't have a lot. In his life history, he said there were many Christmases where they would have had nothing if the neighbors hadn't provided gifts. I remember taking Christmas into needy families, Christmas after Christmas after Christmas. He would come up with enough money to buy a whole Christmas for the family, and he arranged it so we could take it in and put it out as a family and surprise them.
And we did it for years.
And we did too. But I was led by the example of my dad. He was a very diminutive person. He didn't like to be in the limelight. He liked my mom to get all the credit. It was special that he would always do these incredible things for Mom. You've heard of hanging the moon. He would hang the moon. That means he would give her anything that he possibly could. Mink stole.
Anything.
Built a cabin in the mountains so we'd have a family retreat. Had all kinds of special things that he would gift her in clothes and jewelry and nice things like china and silver. Those were all important at that time, and they accumulated some nice things. And I just remember almost a kind of worship that my dad had for my mom, and it might have largely been because of a early experience. My brother Gary came, and I think my mom had preeclampsia. As I look back on whatever it was that she had problems with, and the likelihood is that she wouldn't make it through childbirth. So what happened was that Dad fasted and prayed and promised God that he would serve all his life if he could have my mom live through childbirth. It was like a miracle because there was this specialist in town who was called upon to help her. And there really wasn't any treatment for what she had. He administered like 6 pints or 8 pints of glucose. Whatever that did caused her to get through the condition she had, and Gary was born, and she had 3 other children, and she had all boys. She didn't want any boys. She only wanted girls, and it was, I think she told me that she cried and cried when I was a boy. They did, of course, then they didn't have a way of telling what sex a child would be, and so when we were born boys, she was super sad.
But she compensated by entering you in the...
Yeah, that's right. When I was 5 or 6, I was entered into the East Mill Creek King contest. And my mom couldn't stand the way my hair was. I had a cowlick right here in front. So she gave me a permanent. And I had this big mass of curls, and I won.
It was the
I was
curls.
made the king of East Mill Creek. And I went on the parade on the 4th of July, and then because I guess the king of the parade, of the East Mill Creek parade, got to go in, I got to be in the 24th of July parade as king, and I was up on my throne on the float, and it was, yeah, a special memory. From my dad, I learned to be devoted to my wife, and I learned generosity because I still remember all those occasions when he really tried to make Christmas special for families. Didn't have much, and he remembered his youth and how neighbors made it for him. And so we continued that after we were married, and we tried to provide Christmas often for others if we could. And all my life, I have, that I can remember, I have loved plants. But I think it came because of my mom. She encouraged my dad to build a small greenhouse next to our home in Park Circle. And I got a hobby of growing orchids, which she just loved. And of course, I helped in the landscaping, and I wasn't always willing to do those things. I had to be heavily talked into them, shall we say. I was not great at working chores. That was something I knew I had to do, but I wasn't excited about. Anyway, Mom did instill work habits, and then she taught me the love of plants. She really did. She had a rose garden that was an incredible
Yeah, it was.
rose garden. And
My mom is Margaret Stoddard Farnsworth. My mom was always I don't know how to say it, the face of the family, if you will. My dad was perfectly content to let her take the glory. My dad was born and raised in Magna, Utah, which is a tiny town under the copper mills. Met my mom while they were in business college. They went to, it was Stevens Henniger. And my dad became an accountant. My parents were terrific parents. My dad was more the nurturer. My mom, I think, always wanted to be on Broadway. I really do. She was the, how would you say it, flashy one?
Yeah, very musical.
Yeah, very gifted. We traveled. When I was growing up, we moved. My dad loved travel and wanted to see the world, I know. And so if he got offered a transfer from Hercules, he worked for Hercules Powder, they'd pay all the stuff and we'd go. So we lived in Utah when I was born. We moved to Kansas when I was pretty young.
An experience, I think, with your parents, didn't they get called as mission leaders of some kind?
Yeah, they were the Mission Young Men, Young Women's president. And so they traveled, and usually we traveled with them all over from Miami to all of Alabama. The lesson I learned from my dad was absolute integrity. To do and be who you said you were. The lessons learned from my mom was to be willing to take something on and do your best.
My grandma, on my dad's side, was alone all the time that I knew her. She was a hairdresser and tried to make a living as a hairdresser and raised 11 children. Her husband had practiced polygamy and he had wives several different places. And she left him in an early time. I just don't know how they made it. As I've already described, my dad had very few possessions and things that kids, had at the time, but he got polio, and she got him through that. And she was a very proper lady. My grandma's name was Ada Davis Alder. My grandpa was Rule Alder, but I never met him. I didn't know him at all, and my dad kind of kept me from him. I was kind of disappointed that I didn't get to know him, but Grandma Alder lived alone, and she was just a very kind of like my dad, unassuming, good person, okay? Then my grandparents on my mom's side, as a youngster, they came to live with us because my grandma contracted Parkinson's disease. And she needed kind of extra care. And I remember how hard it was when I was young. I was like 12, and I had to help my grandma on and off the toilet. I mean, 12-year-old boys, didn't do that sort of thing, but it taught me a lot about service. And Grandma struggled as the disease progressed. My grandpa was a fisherman, and I remember one occasion at Fish Lake where we were out on the boat and a terrible thing happened. We stopped to stand fish just by dropping anchor, and my dad asked me to throw the anchor in. And we didn't have a proper anchor. We had a rope tied around a rock. And I lifted the rock and my finger caught the bag of pop gear that my grandfather had handmade. And I threw it overboard without realizing I had the pop gear. And he stayed out there all day trying to snag it and never did. I don't know to this day if he ever forgave me. It was, handwork that took a lot, and it was expensive probably for him. Pop gear is a series of spinners on a long line, and then you put a bait or a lure on the back and wait for a fish.
I have never liked being alone. I've gotten better at it. He can go to work and I can not fall apart. But as a child, it terrified me. And it was when we were living in Alabama. Places like the South invented the 3-hour block simply because they couldn't travel. The travel was too far.
3 meetings, one right after the other.
So, yeah, at church, because the travel was just prohibitive. It was probably it doesn't sound like a lot, but it was probably a 45-minute drive from our home to church. And so it didn't give you time, and they would kind of bunch them together, much like the block now, so that people could come, and then a lot of times they'd hang out and everybody would bring their lunch and they'd have lunch together, and then the next, whatever, sacrament, it used to be Sunday school sacrament, primary. And so it was about 3 hours. I, for whatever reason, was always afraid of being alone. Didn't like it. And so I got left home for this 3 or 4 hour period because they needed to be at church and I was sick. And was pretty sorry for myself and really struggling. And my mom's dad, who I never met, but I'd seen pictures of and heard stories of my whole life, I was feeling really sorry for myself and looked up, and there sitting in a chair was my grandpa. And he just sat there and smiled at me. It was probably less than a minute and was gone. But I knew I wasn't alone. This is my mom's dad, John William Stoddard. I never knew him. He died I think he died in probably 6 months before I was born. But I grew up, I'd heard stories about him and seen pictures. The actual grandpa that I knew, my grandmother remarried, and I adored that grandpa. Mother wouldn't let me call him grandpa. So he was Sam.
Sam Austin.
And his wife had passed away, and my grandfather had passed away, and he and my grandmother, I don't know where they met.
Probably at the temple. They were always at the temple.
But yes, I was going to say, temple behavior came from Sam. But they lived a long and happy life together. And I know it's what, my grandfather, my true grandfather would have wanted. I don't think he'd have wanted my grandma to be alone. This was Lois Eliza Merrill Stoddard Austin.
Oh, let me tell you, she was a ample lady,
Not huge.
not huge, but huggable. And could she give you wonderful hugs?
And wonderful
I told
food.
Marian that one of the reasons I married her was for her grandma. Because I thought, Marian's going to turn out just like her. And I want to be married to a woman like that.
You know, she was happy, she was positive,
Always wanted to feed you.
and take care of you.
She had a pickle barrel downstairs that the stairway was so steep, I don't know how she got up and down. But,
She didn't. She waited till she had kids there.
oh, that's right. Go and get a bottle of mustard pickles.
My dad's parents were Emma Birch and Noble Wilmot Farnsworth. Wilmot, Wilmot. My grandfather, Noble, was disabled the whole time I knew him. There's two diseases similar. One's Paget and the other is Paget. What it does is cause the long bones to grow fast and be soft. And so he was in pain a good part of his adult life, I think. He would not swear in front of my grandma. And so if he was hurting bad and trying to stand up, he would say, "Oh, Jiminy, 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 Jiminy." And, you know, and it would hurt putting weight on those legs.
Did he walk with a cane?
Yeah, he did. You know, nowadays they'd have a walker and it would have been even more comfortable, but all he had was a cane. My mother's mother had false teeth. You had to soak them at night. And so if we would, as kids, go in, there's always a little jar on the back of the sink or whatever with Grandma's teeth in it. And that was, you know, if you grow up with it, it's perfectly normal, right? At my dad's parents' home, my grandfather is the one that had Paget's disease, but he also lost an eye, and he worked at Kennecott in some sort of incident. It happened to have been when a world-famous glass eye maker was visiting in Utah and helping people. As kids, I know, bless my grandpa's heart, we would always stare at him and try to figure out which eye was the artificial eye. No clue. But when he went to bed, he had to soak his eye. And so I'd go to one grandparent's house, and in the windowsill at night were teeth. The other grandparent's house was an eyeball. and, you know, it seems kind of awful, but it was just, as you're growing up, it was just,
Matter of fact.
yeah.